How do you learn from what you read? In this video, I'm going to take a short paragraph and discuss how I read deeply to extract as much knowledge as I can from it. This particular paragraph is about Queen Victoria, the 19th century British monarch. Victoria was born in 1819 into an England mired in economic depression. While most of the country was living hand to mouth, Victoria was spending her formative years in London's Kensington Palace, which not only exuded elegance, but all the creature comforts of the early 19th century. She was the only child of Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. At 50 years of age, the Duke married Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Their only child, Princess Victoria of Kent, was born shortly thereafter. Victoria was less than a year old when her grandfather, George III, died, and her uncle, George IV, succeeded to the throne. And she was only 11 when he died, and her other uncle, the better-liked 64-year-old William IV, took the throne. As the popular William had no legitimate children, Victoria suddenly found herself next in line to take power. Now, if we just approach this paragraph casually, like when we read the news, we might walk away from it just remembering that Victoria was born in the early 1800s and she grew up with an elegant lifestyle. Now, we could also approach learning this text with a flashcard mentality. If we did that, we might try to remember specific facts. Victoria was an only child. Victoria was the son of Edward, Duke of Kent. Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of George III. Now, this gets us more details, but it doesn't give us the connections between these facts, and it tells us nothing about what the text implies, but does not state explicitly. Reading deeply requires a different approach. So here's what I did when I was reading that paragraph. The first sentence tells us that Victoria was born in 1819, and England was in a depression, but Victoria, because she was royalty, was brought up with a posh lifestyle. The second sentence tells us that she is Edward, Duke of Kent's daughter, and Edward himself is the son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. Now, we never want to ignore knowledge that we have when we are reading something. So I already know, based on a very vague understanding of history, that George III was the King of England during the American Revolution. I kind of pinned that time period to the Declaration of Independence, which I think was done in 1776. So I assume that King George III was reigning both in 1776 and during the time when Victoria was born. So King George III had 4 sons, but we've only talked about one of them. So immediately I'm thinking, well, what about the other sons? Edward also got married super late, at 50, to Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, who presumably was much younger than he was because they immediately have a baby, basically after getting married. The next sentence tells us that Queen Victoria was born shortly after the marriage. So when did the marriage happen? Well, the marriage must have happened around 1818 if Victoria was born in 1819. Now, Edward was born about 50 years before that, so approximately in 1768. And since all 3 of his brothers are older than him, they were all born before 1768. The next sentence gives us a lot of extra information. Victoria was less than a year old when King George III died and his son George IV ascended to the throne. So that means that King George III died in 1820 or so, and King George IV ascended in that very same year. Nobody liked him very much. Victoria was 11 when George IV died, and his brother, William IV, ascended to the throne. People liked him a bit better. That event must have happened around 1830. George IV and William IV must have been pretty old when they took over, because Edward was already 51 when George IV took over, and he was about 61 when William IV took over. Now, the text explicitly tells us that William IV was 64 when he took over the throne, so that means that he must have been born in 1766 or so. George III, by contrast, had a fairly long reign. He had 4 children by 1770. He was the ruler, at least I'm pretty sure, in 1776. So his reign must have been close to 50 years, roughly speaking. The text explicitly tells us that William IV didn't have any children to ascend to the throne, which is why Victoria becomes the queen. But you can also make that same assumption for George IV, because otherwise one of the sons of George IV would have become king instead of William IV. Notice at this point we have not looked anything up yet. This is just what we can glean from the text. When we are reading more deeply like this, we take our background knowledge and we take what the text is directly telling us, and we combine those things to figure out what the text is implying but not stating directly. We also usually leave with some open questions, which helps guide our reading in the future. I am intensely curious now. What happened to the other son of George III? We talked about 3 of them. Did the last one die, maybe from a disease or something like this? Or maybe in a war? Given the times, maybe one of those 2 things could have happened, I don't know. What made George IV unpopular and William IV more popular? If I go to Wikipedia now to look up these questions, the information is a lot more relevant to me because I am starting with a question. It's very different to start with a question and try to figure out what the answer is, rather than just reading a general article without any particular question in mind. Now, you don't have to write things down visually like this. I just did that to show you what my thought process was. When I was doing this, I was actually on a train reading this paragraph and just kind of thinking out this timeline to myself as I was reading. Am I going to remember all these details 6 months from now? No, at least not unless I do something extra to remember them. But anything more that I read about this time period, I can attach to this bare bones understanding so that I am kind of enriching and building my knowledge as I am reading more and more. Now you can see how reading to gain knowledge like this, reading deeply, is very different than what a lot of people would call speed reading. You have to take time to understand what the implications are of what you are reading. You have to bring your background knowledge to the fore and kind of use that to grapple with what you're reading, and you have to figure out what the open questions are. If you want to hear more about how reading works, check out this video here. And if you are interested in the history of science, I highly recommend reading The Fossil Hunter, which is the book that I took this paragraph from. It's a really great kind of introduction to early paleontology in England in the early 1800s. Check it out. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.